You think lunchtime classics are all preserved in dusty recipe books? Think again. America's most inventive midday meals were created by resourceful hands, packed in tin pails, and served at kitchen tables, never once written down. Let's dig into 60 forgotten lunch recipes that deserve a place at our tables again. Crackers, sure, they're pretty good even as a typical easygoing breakfast, but what do we really do here? You eat something enough times, you tend to get used to it and get bored. How do you get around that? Well, since the topic is retro dishes, we used to hear a lot about bacon bow tie crackers back in the day. It was something you could find for breakfast or a cocktail appetizer, which is some serious versatility. The crackers were extra crispy since they were wrapped inside bacon and then baked until the bacon itself was pretty crispy. It was the perfect combo, and all they needed was each other to realize that. It was smoky but sweet. It was also savory, but buttery smooth and not dry at all. Dishes that are such neat little combinations like these are often hiding right under your nose, and if we didn't have the imagination of so many home chefs who found these and got them into the public sphere, then we'd be a lot more tasteless as a country. So the next two dishes we have on the list are actually some classics right out of Africa and its many varied cuisines. Fried green tomatoes. No, I am not talking about the 1991 movie by the same name. They were a Depression-era favorite that took something as simple as unripe tomatoes and transformed them into a crispy, delicious dish. Tomatoes that weren't ripe yet were a common sight, and instead of letting them go to waste, people fried them up. For the preparation, you had to slice the tomatoes, coat them in cornmeal or flour, and fry until golden brown and crispy. They were a perfect combination of tangy and crunchy. The slight bitterness of the green tomatoes was balanced with the crunchy cornmeal, which made them surprisingly addicting. Again, they were a good way to get your kids to eat some veggies and fuel their bodies with healthy nutrients. As an added bonus, they were extremely cheap to make, using the ingredients everybody had on hand. Fried green tomatoes were a great way to add variety to meals during the Depression. I think this dish takes the cake as the most unbelievable, because it's one thing to eat and use up old veggies that are near their expiration date. But to eat unripe fruits and vegetables, that's a whole other story. But this meal should serve as an example of how far people would go to survive in the hard times. Corn fritters with syrup were some of the best eating you could get during the Dust Bowl. It was one of the things that really started the entire tradition of corn and syrups being so popular, especially around winter and holiday season. The simple, humble, and very frugal mix of cornmeal, molasses-filled syrup, and just a bit of hot oil and fat was amazing. It was especially good around the cold because this was the kind of dish you would serve to people when you really wanted them to warm up. You wouldn't even need a lot to make the cornmeal batter either. A cup of cornmeal, some salt, water, and corn kernels, or 2 tablespoons of fat. That's it. Everything else was either really optional or just there to give it a better texture and consistency, which, let's be honest, wasn't really anyone's #1 priority back then. Back then, the way people would stretch their rations and pantries was by eating things like these regularly. Actually, I bet people ate way more of the corn-based dishes you see on this list than anything else. Bisco Snackmate Cheese was this line of processed cheese spreads that came in a bit of an unconventional packaging, which was pressurized cans. They were supposed to be enjoyed as an after-school snack, and they were a lunchbox edition. Kids could usually take it along as a spread and put it on top of whatever their actual meal was in the lunchbox, like crackers with mate cheese spread all over them. Parents would often send their children with breadsticks or give them other kinds of foods like pita breads that you could spread the cheese on, and honestly, it worked pretty well. If you got a hot dog and some Snackmate cheese, then you could consider yourself the luckiest person alive. The cheese spread was incredibly popular. It was a little messy, but that made it even more enticing because it gave off that gooey, melted cheese vibe that a lot of cheese products would desperately aim for. Snackmate had a lot of portability too, since it was one of the first pre-packed cheese snacks to do it. Either way, this had all the support it needed to end up being a market favorite. Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like apple Bettys than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. Carrot and potato hash was a Depression-era staple that made the most out of two cheap and hearty veggies. Potatoes were filling while carrots added just enough sweetness to keep things interesting. This meal was perfect for stretching a limited budget because both ingredients were as cheap as they come, lasted forever, and could be found in almost every kitchen. The preparation was simple. Chop up the vegetables, toss them in a hot pan, and fry until golden and crispy. It was simple, but the combination of soft potatoes and slightly caramelized carrots created a comforting, flavorful dish. If you had an onion lying around, it could join the party, adding even more depth to this humble hash. The beauty of carrot and potato hash is in its versatility. You could eat it on its own or throw an egg on top for some protein. Either way, it was filling, warm, and super satisfying. Everything you needed to keep going during tough times. It wasn't the most exciting dish, but it got the job done. And isn't that what really counts? Chili beans and crushed crackers were just another meal from the never-ending nightmare that was the 1930s. But this one's just a bit more special than the rest. Maybe it's the one that got away in the entire history of food in the States. Maybe it's just how it became a staple of the culture later on, but this one always stood out. Chili beans and crackers were more than just a way to fill up for the evening. They were sometimes all you had. It wouldn't be so irregular to come back home from work, the most grueling shift of the week now safely behind you, and immediately be greeted by a bowl of chili beans and crushed crackers. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a time when people's wallets ran dry, it was also a time when their fields did too. It was very common for crops to fail, and families would often just live off of the tiny bits they could salvage. Basically, chili beans were the only recourse left to people in times like that. The last line of defense, you could say. It wasn't expensive, it filled you up, and it tasted just a bit more normal than everything else. You could say it was probably one of the few things people were eating that actually even had any taste anymore. You could get the entire thing in about 15 cents, and it would make you a lot happier. Guess that's why people look back on it with so much sentimentality. What do you think? Any comforting memories you can stir up and associate with a bowl of chili beans? Speaking of quick and easy comfort food that'll keep your kids filled and quiet, Hunt's Snack Pack Chocolate Pudding was arguably the undisputed heavyweight champ of this stuff. It was packaged in these small metal cans and it could easily be put into a lunchbox, so it already had packaging and portability covered. Hey, believe it or not, that's a big marketing goal for snacks to fill. The easier it is to walk around with them and pop one open whenever you need it, the better it sells. And that's just not something Hunt's Snack Pack Chocolate Pudding ever had to worry about. Plus, that was the early days of the pudding. Later on, the design went from a plastic cup and it was made even more lunchbox friendly. Also, probably their best quality was the fact that you didn't need to refrigerate these, and then they also came in a lot of different flavors beyond just chocolate, so suffice it to say this thing had all the steam and creativity it needed to capture a serious chunk of the market itself, and kids were definitely enamored with what they were getting. You'd always hear a kid or two begging their parents to get the chocolate pudding in most typical grocery stores, so if you were around in the 80s, you definitely know what I'm talking about. I know we've had some wacky sandwiches and spread combinations in the history of the nation so far. A lot of those started off as slightly divisive, but they ended up making a place for themselves, growing out of the niches they carved into the food culture in America. Unfortunately, for fluffernutter sandwiches, It really did stay mostly as a niche, but a pretty good one. This takes your typical bread, nothing really special, and your typical peanut butter, again, nothing you haven't seen around the block 1,000 times, and adds a bit of a twist. You ever think about what peanut butter could be stacked on top of some thick marshmallow creme? Me neither, until I was searching about the history of this dish and how they were a Massachusetts classic. Known as Liberty sandwiches and made by Emma Curtis in 1918, it was described as the perfect wholesome snack to get you a sugar rush whenever you needed it. Also, it was stupidly popular with children, especially around campfires. While we're on the topic of sweets, let's talk about baked apples with cinnamon. They were the ultimate Depression-era dessert which could turn just a few apples into something that felt warm and comforting. Apples were relatively inexpensive and easy to come by, and baking them with a sprinkle of cinnamon transformed them into a dessert that made everyone feel like they were indulging. Making baked apples was as simple as coring the apples, placing them in a dish, and stuffing the centers with a mix of cinnamon, sugar, and maybe a little butter if you had some. And into the oven, they'd go. In a matter of minutes, your house smelled like a bakery from dreams. The apples would soften. Their natural sweetness was enhanced by the cinnamon, and the result was a dish that felt way more luxurious than it actually was. This was a dessert that required very few ingredients, but the payoff was huge. It was warm and delicious, and made you feel like you were eating something truly special, even in the middle of hard times. Whether served on their own or with a bit of cream if you had it, baked apples with cinnamon were a simple pleasure that lifted spirits without draining the pantry. So, homemade macaroni with milk gravy. That was as fancy as you got during the Dust Bowl, and to be fair, it's a pretty good point to stop at. I mean, I still get really giddy when I come home to some macaroni, leftover or fresh. Now, there are some good benefits to macaroni as well. It's got a decent amount of carbohydrates and a lot of calories too, so you get a full meal out of it. The milk gravy, on the other hand, is really good for adding some flavor into your dish. We all know macaroni is a wonderful foundation for a good dish, but not a good thing to eat on its own. Gets real bland, no? Just not something that gives you an intense appetite. Add some milk gravy, on the other hand, and you actually end up with a pretty decent dish. Here's another spin for you. If you had leftover macaroni with milk gravy, you could even make a new dish out of it. Add in some fat drippings, herbs, vegetables, or whatever you have, and you end up with an entirely new flavor profile. Convenient, right? So where does macaroni rank on your comfort food list, if it has a place at all? And what do we think about milk gravy? Share all your thoughts down below. I grew up with a lot of Kraft. It was a cheap, affordable cereal brand that knew how to get the job done, and honestly, you can't ask for much more. One of their most prolific ones, I think, was Kugel in 1971. Despite it having a relatively short career to stuff like Frosties, the flavored peanut spread knew its market and it came at it viciously. It came in all kinds of flavors that were just aimed right at kids, and looking back, they had some pretty good aim. It was so hard to resist that banana and vanilla as a kid. I mean, a lot of parents, especially single ones, didn't always have the time to prepare a full-fledged lunchbox with different sections and assortments of food. Sometimes you just need something that gets the job done quick and gets it done right, and Kugel was perfect for that. Parents eventually became more aware about the nutritional value that their children were getting out of stuff like store-bought cereals and packaged food. But for the time it was there, it did pretty good. Honestly, I wouldn't mind having a bowl as an office lunch, even as an adult. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies, and this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Depression-era mac and cheese was a budget-friendly comfort food that made you feel like you were living large on a dime. While today's mac and cheese might be full of fancy and expensive cheeses, back in the day, it was all about making the most out of basic ingredients. A boxed pasta, some milk, and only if you were lucky, some cheese. But you better pull that smile off your face. It wasn't the gooey, cheesy kind that we know of today. It was more of a humble, lightly cheesy dish that could fill you up, don't get me wrong. The trick was stretching those precious bits of cheese as far as humanly possible. People would thin it out with milk or even water. And if money was really, really tight, they would use flour to make a roux, a mixture of flour and fat that was used to thicken sauces. It definitely wasn't gourmet, but it was cheap, and the most important of all, it was food. Even with such limited sources, this dish managed to be a crowd pleaser, especially with kids, who were just excited to be eating pasta. Depression-era mac and cheese was a smart way to turn a few simple ingredients into a meal that seemed indulgent, even if it was light years away from today's extravaganza. But you have to admit, sometimes you don't want that fully spiced up mac and cheese. Sometimes you crave a simple canned version that won't make you regret eating it later. And that's exactly what Depression-era mac and cheese achieved. Teddy Grahams were introduced by Nabisco somewhere in the late 1980s, and they were these bite-sized graham crackers that had been shaped like teddy bears, available in flavors like honey, cinnamon, chocolate, and a lot more. Their adorable little shapes and that soft afternote of sweetness made them a hit with children. They had a flavor that hit all the right spots, but just wasn't overpowering or even too bland. It was right in that perfect middle ground. It meant that kids could get addicted to the stuff. Honestly. The thing about snacks like sour candy is exactly that they're better as a few bites, not a snack you keep binging on, because they're overpowering. The thing about snacks like crackers is that they work great as binge material, but don't really mean much as far as a fulfilling food experience goes, because they're just a little too bland. Teddy Grahams by Nabisco had the equation more or less solved. They had a perfect design that made them really appealing to kids, they were easy to share, and they fit either as desserts or as the perfect combo for a cheese spread or sandwich. Plus, they were made using whole grains, which meant that as far as their PR with parents was considered, they were doing pretty well. Parents were suckers for snacks that did even the barest of minimums with their nutritional value. And this is a pretty solid example. I mean, whole grains are good, but if health really is your concern, you need a lot more out of your breakfast. Still, no one can argue they had extreme value for money. For real, you didn't need anything more than a few packets of these and a nice spread to have a decent meal at school. Nose? Not really feeling up to whatever you have to do today? Or are you just plain down? Maybe you need to give that metabolism a kick. Meals like stuffed bell peppers, especially with barley and vegetables, were some of the best things you could get. Stuffed bell peppers were some of the best ways people could keep their moods up during the Dust Bowl and Depression. You might be wondering what all those questions have to do with what we're discussing right now. Well, don't you think allergies spread like wildfire when the winds are carrying all kinds of filthy dust across the country? What about your daily tasks? Think you can manage them on such an empty stomach? Poverty really keeps a person down too, and poor nutrition messes badly with your body's functions, especially metabolism. See, tiny, progressively worse health issues like that were so common, and it just wasn't possible for people to go to the doctor for them. Peppers, on the other hand, not only release chemicals that naturally make you feel better, they also warm up your body temperature, help with basic symptoms of allergies, and give your metabolism a much-needed kick. They were also wildly inexpensive, and in fact, a lot of people got a good green thumb and eventually started growing them in their gardens. You add barley and vegetables to that, and you're pretty much eating as healthy as a person can be during the Depression. If your grandmother's cooking as much as we do, then hop on to tour her lunch table. A name you might not hear very often in the cooking world, as far as French cuisine is concerned at least, is Marie-Antoine Carême, but you can thank her for some amazing dishes such as the vol au vent. This is actually something that got so popularized in American cookbooks in the mid-20th century. In the 1970s, when a national interest in foreign cooking really started popping off in America, there were a lot of trends centered around haute cuisine, and especially things you would find in premium French restaurants. In French-American communities, a vol au vent was a typical Saturday lunch that you would find being served up by your grandmother. Marie-Antoine Carême is a legendary French chef, and a reason she got that acclaim was because she managed to make up dishes that would suit the average household. Vol au vent is actually not really something you'd find at a five-star restaurant or on the upper end of what your wallet could afford. Most people would treat this like a party meal, something to serve at cocktail parties or New Year's ones. It was just puff pastry filled in with chicken, mushrooms, and creamy sauces, but it blended all of those together to make a really warm and earthy taste, which makes it perfectly suited to something you'd associate with your grandma's table. Savory bread pudding with leftover veggies was the ultimate Depression-era hack for turning scraps into a hearty meal. Got stale bread? Perfect. Leftover veggies that are past their prime? Even better. This dish was all about not wasting a thing. People couldn't afford to throw food away during the Great Depression, but instead, they got creative. And this meal was one of those everything but the kitchen sink meals that you might have heard your grandma or great-grandma talking about. To make it, you had to tear up the stale bread, mix it with eggs and milk and whatever leftover vegetables you had lying around. It could be basically anything. Carrots, peas, whatever didn't make the cut for last night's dinner. Season it with salt and pepper and maybe some herb seasoning and bake until it is golden and crispy on top, but soft and warm inside. The best part about savory bread pudding was that it made something delicious out of things you would usually throw away. And the Great Depression didn't look kindly upon those who didn't know how to save up. Stale bread was transformed from slices into a cozy meal that tasted like it took more effort than it actually did. This dish proved that even in hard times, you could make a meal out of practically nothing. So, if corn was sitting pretty at number 1 in terms of what was easy to get, what would you say number 2 was? Well, historians would pretty much agree with potatoes being the popular choice. Particularly, having potatoes with onion soup and bread was another way for people to tick off 3 things from their daily routines: nutrition, a full meal, and enough food to go around the entire table. Potatoes were pretty much just 5 cents per pound, and this was right around the earliest years. The reason you wanted to keep a massive stock of these bad boys was because they were built for survival situations. They last literally forever. I mean, I think I've had a few potatoes that have been around since the Prohibition. Secondly, their other name is versatility. Fry it, boil it, steam it, mash it, or dice it. Whatever way you repurpose a potato, you'll get a damned good meal out of it. Plus, the fact that they're full of carbs makes them one of the best things to eat during a drought because it keeps your appetite low. Bread and onions were pretty much priced around the same price point, and that meant that people were able to make a good soup out of the 3 pretty easily. Now let's be real. People were definitely lowballing their standards just to be able to enjoy the meal, especially after the 56th time they had it, but it was still a lot easier to swallow than other alternatives. Tuna twist was this seasoning mix that General Foods came up with in the 1970s. Plain canned tuna on its own was an extremely boring and bland dish. I mean, to be fair, anything would get that way after literal years of eating it, especially after kids had to get so used to rationing and eating low-tier food like canned tuna every day for dinner. But that's why they had things like tuna twists, giving the old reliable a new kick that restored its spark in the eyes of the people. It came in packets that had flavors like onion or cheddar, and the cheddar one obviously did better. The catch is they tend to be mixed with tuna and mayo, which makes it a tuna salad, and they were actually really good for these quick and easy DIY sandwiches. They didn't even really need a lot of work to assemble, but if you were giving them as a lunchbox meal, you needed to be prepared for. Tuna twists didn't do that well with children because it just wasn't a taste that they were really familiar with. But parents are nothing if not crafty. They'd make sandwiches out of these and dress it up with some bacon or chips and barbecue sauce, and kids wouldn't even be able to tell the difference. So don't be fooled. These got more mileage than you'd think. Always associate with your grandma's cooking is waffles. There was no place in the world that could make a waffle better than your grandma, which is a belief that a lot of kids would fight you over. And I really do mean fight you over. For the kids, the peak of the experience was probably just getting those freshly baked waffles with maple sauce poured all over them. But for grandmas, the best part of the dish was how you could sneak in other things that the kids really needed and didn't eat enough of along with them. For example, one of the most popular combinations was catfish and waffles. Now, I don't really need to give you a rundown on America's relationship with catfish, especially around coastal and rural areas that are near lakes and rivers or anywhere you'd find catfish swimming around. It's one of the most affordable and easy-to-make meals, and you can spin it 100 different ways. Baked catfish, fried catfish, steamed catfish, it just doesn't get old. You take it a bit further and match it up with waffles, which gives them that contrast that cooks are always looking to give to catfish with sauces and spices. But it doesn't really hit the spot like this does. It goes to show that you never really can teach grandmas anything, can you? Cabbage and potato stew was a Depression-era lifesaver that filled you up without emptying your wallet. Cabbage was very cheap, and potatoes added the starchy heartiness that needed to make this stew a stick-to-your-ribs kind of meal. You'd chop up the cabbage and potatoes, toss them into a big pot with some water or broth, and let it all simmer until soft and flavorful. If you had a carrot or onion lying around, throw that in too, it wouldn't hurt. This stew surely wasn't the most glamorous meal of all, but it got the job done. Were you fed after it? Yes. So it did what it needed to do. It could feed the whole family while costing almost next to nothing. The best part, you might wonder? That big batch you made yesterday is even better tasting today. In tough times, cabbage and potato stew was the definition of comfort food. It wasn't fancy, but it was nourishing, satisfying, and made the most out of simple ingredients. Plus, cabbage could stretch for days, so this meal often became a household staple when the budget was tight. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich, too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. Tomato soup with rice was a Depression-era lunch that combined simplicity with a great deal of comfort. You didn't need much in order to make it. Just a can of tomatoes, or even water and tomato paste, a handful of rice, and any seasoning you like. This was the perfect meal for a cold, rainy day when you needed something warm and filling that could stretch your ingredients and make them last a week. Rice was the main deal here. It could bulk up the soup, turning a thin tomato broth into a hearty meal. With rice, you can always assume that a little goes a long way, and it turned what could have been a sad bowl of red water into a meal that actually felt like food. Plus, rice was very cheap, so adding that to your meals meant you made sure that a small pot of soup could feed the whole family. And while it wasn't really gourmet, you could get your creative freak on and make it special. A few tricks included adding a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity and a pinch of garlic powder to make it zesty. Tomato soup with rice was the kind of meal that will get you through hard times, without making you feel like you were missing out on some great delicacy. It was simple, satisfying, and budget-friendly. You might be surprised to hear this one, but people actually got enough turnip stew and dumplings to make a meal out of it. You might be thinking dumplings sound pretty expensive for a time when the wins themselves were stacked against your bank account, but hear me out. Dumplings were actually insanely economical, and loads of Americans had begun to make real efforts to learn how to make some good ones. Dumplings used flour, water, fat, and some baking powder. All of this basically costs around 5 to 10 cents individually, minus the fat and water. Since people usually wouldn't have fat to work with, they'd use lard. People were making dumplings at home and mixing them up with stews, broths, and just about everything else they worked with. Now, turnips, on the other hand, those were the actual tricky things to get. It's exactly because they were easy to cultivate and one of the few things that actually worked with the climate of the Great Plains that people were so quick to ravage the stores for them. As a side effect of that, most people simply resorted to growing them in their gardens, because at least you'd know for a fact you'd wake up to some turnips. Banana flips were these extremely popular snack cakes that came as a result of Nichols Bakery doing some product innovation, and they completely outsold the competition. Think of the softest banana-flavored cake you have, and think about it being filed with the creamiest, richest filling you've ever conceived in your head. These banana flips were more than a treat. They were an experience, a delightful break in a school day, and a reliable classic to come back to. Parents felt like they were giving their kids something substantial, while kids felt like they had the best dessert in their hands without it even being dessert. There was something so fun about unwrapping the foil, that unmistakable smell of bananas and sweet cream hitting the air, and taking that first bite. Whether as an after-school snack or a midday surprise, banana flips had a reputation of their own. Other snack cakes just couldn't compete with this powerhouse of taste, texture, and nostalgia. Truly, a piece of 70s lunchbox history, banana flips were here to bring joy, satisfy cravings, and turn a regular school lunch into a treat worth remembering. It's absolutely the perfect lunch or dish to send your kids to school with. It became a lunchbox favorite because even if you did put this in a lunchbox for a few hours, it could completely withstand everything and still be just as fresh as when you got it off the store. It was a great way to get that sweet tooth satisfied and kept in check without going overboard with some home baking. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. Deviled eggs with pickles were a treat that turned humble ingredients into something delicious back in the day. Eggs were a cheap, reliable protein source, and if you had a jar of pickles, you were already halfway to creating something fancy, by 1930s standards anyway. Making deviled eggs is nothing revolutionary. Just hard-boil them, scoop out the yolk, and mix with a little mayo, mustard, and the thing that ties it all together: pickles. The pickles added a crunch that took the eggs from plain food to a party snack. However, the only party trick was surviving yet another day on a shoestring budget. People loved deviled eggs because they felt like a special treat, even when times were tough. The pickles added that little something extra, like a surprise flavor bomb in the middle of your egg. Plus, it was a great way to stretch a meal. Eggs were filling and they were perfect for families who had to make do with limited supplies. Whether served at lunch or as a snack, deviled eggs with pickles were a fun, zesty way to make an ordinary ingredient feel a little more special. While I know for a fact you've definitely had some unappetizing meals, let's talk about some good rub. Sweet potato and corn chowder was one of the best things you could get for yourself. See, again, this was a lot like chili beans and crushed crackers. It was sustenance, it was filling, it was a friend to fall back on during hard times, but it was warm. No, I don't mean that it had a decently high temperature. I mean the kind of warmth you feel after having a good hangout with your friends, or a really good meal your mother cooked. Emotional comfort, joy, all that good stuff. Sweet potato and corn chowder was a soup that felt like a soup, and it was also something that really made you healthy as you regularly ate more of it. Plus, people began to grow sentimental attachments to their crops. You have to understand that these were not people who had been raised in the way of farming. Their hands had no calluses, and their eyes couldn't tell how deep you needed to plant a crop. They had a lot of trial and error before they could reliably start growing things like sweet potatoes and corn, and once they did, it tasted even better because they knew it was a result of their hard work. Cheese Tidbits by Sunshine are these small and cheesy crackers which were for like a few cents apiece. If you compared them to a modern-day invention, then they would be a lot like Cheez-Its, and those are the delicious bite-sized squares you always see children fawning over. As a snack, they were easy to appeal to kids with. They had everything you needed going for them after all. Kids enjoyed easy, savory snacks that came with a cheesy kick and a crunchy bite. That really was the formula, and it honestly still is. So you can imagine how well they do with children. They were packed in these portion sizes, which made them perfect for binging. And sometimes, if your kid wanted a lighter snack but still something that they could enjoy at school easily on their own, then this was the perfect thing to give them. Plus, it wasn't just savory. It had some pretty nice sweet notes too, which made it a bit different from the other cheese-based snacks of the time. You hear the name rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? Corn fritters were a Depression-era favorite because they made something out of almost nothing. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and very versatile, so in times when money was tight, corn fritters were everyone's go-to. All you needed was a little cornmeal, flour, water, or milk, and an egg if you could afford one. Mix it all up, fry it in some oil, and lunch is served. These fritters were the perfect way to turn pastry staples into something delicious. They were crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and packed with flavor. And because cornmeal was so affordable, you could whip up a batch without thinking about how much money it cost. You could even throw in whatever you had in the house to stretch it even more and add nutritional value. Any leftover veggies or cheese added more flavor to the meal, making it even more comforting. Corn fritters were the kind of meal that made you feel resourceful and proved that even in hard times, you could take a handful of basic ingredients and make them into something delicious. In pretty much exactly the same vein, you had brown bread and baked beans. Look, no matter how bad things get, you really can't change human nature. People need to switch things up, or before starvation and poverty take them, boredom and monotony will. One of the best ways to keep things fresh in the household was to just switch out the potatoes and onions for some baked beans. You had your typical beans, the same ones people were eating with cornbread, but they'd just be baked instead. This would give them a warm, toasty feeling, and you can definitely already guess how that came in clutch during wintertime. Oh yeah, winters during the Dust Bowl were a vivid scene out of hell. Those winds were sharp and cold enough to split your bones, but holding on to some sense of comfort thanks to your bowl of baked beans and bread was a little joy that pushed people far enough into the new year and eventually the next season. Lipton's a pretty global brand. You could go from America to Pakistan and still recognize it, but it was in the 70s that they were known for a very specific kind of instant lunch that was a lot like cup noodles were, but think of the textures of spaghetti instead of what you would normally associate with instant noodles. Muggo lunch came in flavors like spaghetti, noodles with cheese sauce, and even barbecue, and its biggest selling point was easily that this is a pretty convenient lunch to pack for your kid as they merrily embark on their way to school. It actually didn't get its start that way, though. It started as an after-school snack that parents would serve to their kids, but they then saw the value of sending them to school with it. It was more popular with kids in grade school because they had a better appreciation for things like this. Usually, kids in elementary stuck to some pretty basic foods, but there was one issue with Muggo lunch. You needed hot water to prepare it, and sometimes, some parents would expect the kids to do that themselves, though the reason is beyond me. Anyway, not every school had access to hot water, so Muggo lunch eventually faded out in favor of more accessible lunches. I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents' baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was, but what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Spaghetti with garlic and olive oil was a Depression-era meal that proved you could make something delicious from only 3 ingredients: spaghetti, garlic, and olive oil. You could whip up a dish that felt fancy without emptying your wallet. This was the kind of meal that made you look like you knew what you were doing in the kitchen, even when you were just throwing stuff together. Boil the spaghetti, then toss it in a pan with sizzling garlic and olive oil, and in a matter of seconds, your home smelled like an Italian restaurant. Sure, you didn't have any meat or sauce, but who needs them when you have garlic to do all the heavy lifting? Olive oil gave the pasta a nice, silky coat, while the garlic brought the savory punch that made you forget how simple the dish actually was. If you had the means, you would sprinkle some Parmesan or red pepper flakes on top, but even without these extras, the pasta hit the spot. This dish was a Depression-era go-to because it was cheap, easy, and quick to make. And sometimes, less is more. So people had some different ways of incorporating split pea soup and bread into their diets during the Depression. One of the most common ways to do it was to have the split pea soup just be a one-pot meal. Why did this work? Well, to save you a long story detailing why cooking it in one pot works, it was most usually prepared that way. Plus, the broth it would simmer in would work really well as a side. Season that with just some basic things like salt and pepper, and you have yourself a pretty full meal. The next thing to do was to crumble the bread into the soup and then pretty much just use it to thicken the soup. Sometimes people did this because otherwise the soup in question was just a little too runny and thin. How could it be anything else? You might be thinking of the typical, conventional soups we're used to, but this was literally just beans and water. Then still, there were people who used the bread as a topping, and they'd dip pieces of the bread, scoop up the peas, and make a bite out of it. It was switching things up in little ways like this that helped people keep their sanity intact through the back-to-back madness that was the 1930s. Aspen soda was supposed to be this apple-flavored soda that was introduced by PepsiCo, and it was brought forward in 1978. The entire appeal of this thing was that it was a great alternative to traditional cola, and it had everything that conventional forms of cola didn't. Soda couldn't be a lunchbox item because it had a size and weight that just wasn't suitable for most lunchboxes. But Aspen's took care of that with a nifty little packaging that made it perfect for taking along as a lunchbox to school with, and it became an occasional novelty too. Kids would bring it to school on many occasions, and older kids who were in bigger classes had access to vending machines, since parents still were not too keen on sending their kids to school with soda every day. It also came in a glass bottle, and that meant that it stayed chiller for longer and had a better overall taste. It gained a pretty strong niche following, so I guess they definitely did do some things right. Speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did, though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. Moving on to something sweet for a second, rice pudding with raisins. It was a Depression-era answer to a comforting dessert made from almost nothing. Leftover rice, milk or water, some sugar, and a handful of raisins were all it took to make your kids happy with a sweet treat. The magic happened when the rice simmered down into a creamy, pudding-like consistency, turning something so plain into a dessert that felt a little indulgent. Raisins were the main show here. They added the perfect amount of taste and texture, making it taste fancy rather than ordinary. Just the thought of raisins makes me want to retch. I truly admire the strength our ancestors had when they were able to eat food like this. Don't get me wrong, I love rice pudding, but raisins? No way, not a chance. The best part about rice pudding is how flexible the recipe could be. If you were like me and didn't like raisins, you could just sprinkle some cinnamon on top, or maybe even a splash of vanilla if you were feeling fancy. For families looking to make a warm, sweet, and filling dessert, rice pudding with raisins was the perfect way to go. It satisfied almost every sweet tooth without costing much, making it a household favorite. Plus, it was really simple to make, so even the kids could help and stir the pot. Some of those kids are now our grandparents teaching us those same recipes. How beautiful is that? Another use of bread that was honestly way past its expiry date was savory bread pudding with onions and herbs. People would use this bread to add some kind of carbs to their meal. Plus, it also helped them stay full longer, so there was always that. You could easily grow the onions, and caramelizing them, regardless of the era or the ongoing crisis, was never really much effort for anyone. So you'd end the day with some bread pudding, and whatever spices, herbs, and vegetables you had, you'd throw in there so you would just get a smidgen of flavor. This was definitely something that was more common in urban areas, though, because it really needed an oven. That meant that people who were living in rural areas were pretty much barred from ever having this dish. It wasn't something you could make over an open fire, but it was definitely good for families. You could even serve beans on the side. People in rural areas tried to mimic it with porridge made out of bread, but that was never really the same. Space food sticks were something that Pillsbury came up with in the 1990s, and this was a snack that had, as you can guess from the name itself, a lot of themes centered around the starry and cold expanse that is space. It was also meant to be designed with astronauts in mind. No, they weren't selling the stuff to astronauts, but they knew what they had to pull with children. At the time, in the 1980s, there was nothing that invoked a sense of adventure and thrill more nigh a child than an astronaut braving all odds and going to space just like their favorite superheroes. So when they got the food sticks, you can only guess how well the advertising and packaging may have worked. These dry sticks were peanut butter, caramel, and chocolate flavored, and its whole shtick was how it was space food. That definitely made it catch on even more with kids who were younger and a lot more gullible, but hey, it had a long shelf life, it was transportable, and it was cheap enough. What kind of parent passes up on a good snack to shut your kid up with? Hoppin' John's soup, which is right out of the classics of soul food in the southern parts of America and all over, really. I say the South because that's where people most commonly associate its origins with. However, the Hoppin' John dish itself was something that was a result of all the Africans that were brought over as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. This dish typically involves black-eyed peas and African rice, but in soup form, it works just as well with mushrooms, basic vegetables like bell peppers and spices. This is one of the best soups you could find yourself making in the winter, especially if you live in areas where the temperature really drops to bone-chilling levels. It's so hearty and warm that the dish just screams pure comfort in every way and form. It was a really popular appetizer on a lot of restaurant menus, and it was amazing as a lunch too, but this is a textbook example of an old head recipe. You wouldn't remember it, and your parents probably don't either if they're a little on the young side, but I'm sure anyone's grandparents would remember having this, or at least hearing about it in the days when it was still one of the trendiest soups around. You already know what the deal is with potatoes. Besides just that, though, you might be surprised to know people really cozied up to cabbage. It only makes sense for cabbage and potato stew to be such a popular combination then. Why did this happen? How did it happen? Well, they just had chemistry, for lack of a better word. Cabbages were just as easy to grow as potatoes were, and they cost around the exact same, namely just 5 to 10 cents. You gotta understand one thing about living in times like this too. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, was eating for pleasure. People had two approaches to food during the entire Dust Bowl era. One was that you had to eat things that were filling because it would save costs. The other was that you had to eat things that would keep you healthy and free of sickness because it would save costs. By now, I think the entire national poverty aspect of all of this might really start to sink in. Either way, cabbage and potato stew was adept at satisfying both of those needs, so it only made sense that people made it such a regular meal at their tables. Pizza spins, on the other hand, were this snack that General Mills came up with in the 1960s. The idea here was to come up with a pizza that was also a snack. So let's think of this as like the grandfather of Lunchables, but this time they actually succeeded at what they were trying to do. They were this endearing mix of tomato, cheese, and spices that actually mimicked the pizza flavor quite well. It was supposed to be this spiral-shaped pizza, and it was definitely really popular for the kids. It was mess-free, easy to pack, flavorful, and affordable, making it a standout in the lunchbox category that parents couldn't resist giving their kids. Makes sense too. You get an instant version of a pizza, and even if it isn't the real thing, you'd be tempted to take it to school too. It's just how the world is. The kid that ends up bringing pizza to school always just does a bit better than the others. Even at a grade school level, politicking never stops. Something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Cabbage and potato stew was a Depression-era lifesaver that filled you up without emptying your wallet. Cabbage was very cheap, and potatoes added the starchy heartiness that needed to make this stew a stick-to-your-ribs kind of meal. You'd chop up the cabbage and potatoes, toss them into a big pot with some water or broth, and let it all simmer until soft and flavorful. If you had a carrot or onion lying around, throw that in too, it wouldn't hurt. This stew surely wasn't the most glamorous meal of all, but it got the job done. Were you fed after it? Yes. So it did what it needed to do. It could feed the whole family while costing almost next to nothing. The best part, you might wonder? That big batch you made yesterday is even better tasting today. In tough times, cabbage and potato stew was the definition of comfort food. It wasn't fancy, but it was nourishing, satisfying, and made the most out of simple ingredients. Plus, cabbage could stretch for days, so this meal often became a household staple when the budget was tight. Dandelion green salad with vinegar dressing was a really practical and nutritious dish. Dandelions were things you could grow not just in your makeshift DIY backyard gardens, but were something that was simply abundant in nature. Dandelions grew everywhere. They were there in yards and fields, and that meant that people used them as much as they possibly could. People were foraging all kinds of spots in nature for any dandelions they could pick up. Every part of the thing was valuable: the greens, the roots, the seed itself. Dandelion leaves in particular were things people kept for their nutritious and medicinal properties, and like I said, if it kept the doctor away, it was something you'd have every day. The vinegar dressing, on the other hand, was something you just needed salt and vinegar for too. Throw in some corn, and you had yourself a knockout meal, really. Fried chicken patties were introduced to American schools in the 1980s and quickly became a favorite due to their similarity to popular fast food. These patties are made from ground chicken mixed with spices, then breaded with flour and breadcrumbs to create a crispy outer layer. The frying process transforms these prepared patties into golden, crunchy delights with a juicy interior, typically served as sandwiches or with sides like fries. The method of preparing these patties is well suited to the high-volume requirements of school cafeterias, involving simple steps that can be executed quickly: mixing, forming, breading, and frying. This efficiency ensures that delicious hot meals can be served promptly, reducing wait times and maximizing student satisfaction during lunch breaks. This is a bit of a tricky name to pronounce even when you give it a genuine try, but it's worth knowing about this dish because of how good it is. Ballymaloe Irish lamb stew is something that comes all the way from County Cork, and lamb stew is something that Americans welcome with very open arms. You can particularly find this dish being spread in droves around St. Patrick's Day in any Irish-American community. Whether you're in New Hampshire or Rhode Island, which even today have a pretty solid amount of Irishmen living in them, you're bound to run into a Ballymaloe stew once in a while. Despite how good of a stew it is, with tender carrots, potatoes, and tender strips of lamb, and how simple the preparation is since it relies mostly on the natural flavors present in the ingredients, this dish actually flopped once before. Well, I wouldn't say it was a true flop, but it did fade out of the memory of the general public before too. That was before the 20th century, but ever since then it has been seeing a bit of a revival thanks to social media and Ballymaloe House, which is what it's named after. Either way, this is one of the best recipes to ever come out of a family cookbook. And if you've ever had one while at an Irish friend's home, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Fried rice with vegetables was the ultimate Depression-era hack for making leftovers exciting again. Day-old rice was the perfect base because it was cheap, filling, and easy to stretch. And just like with rice pudding with raisins, rice came to steal the show. You'd take whatever vegetables were on hand, carrots, peas, onions, or anything nearing its expiration date, toss them in a hot pan with a bit of oil, and fry it all together until golden and fragrant. Nothing, and I mean nothing, goes to waste. This dish was about making the most of what you had. It didn't matter if the veggies were a little past their prime because once they hit the pan, they were given a new life. A little soy sauce or garlic added a ton of flavor, and if you were lucky enough to have an egg, you could crack one in for extra protein. The fried rice was a genius way to turn scraps into something satisfying. It was fast, flavorful, and filling, everything you needed in a meal when times were tough. Plus, it was incredibly versatile. You could throw in any leftover meat or keep it vegetarian, and it would still be a hearty dish that stretched the food budget. Carrot soup with some amazing, homely crackers made right in the comfort of your kitchen was the ideal breakfast and lunch going around during the dusty apocalypse that plagued the land. It was cheap, it was fresh, and the carrots were super good for you. Carrots were grown a lot in Victory Gardens, and they were a staple, really. Most people dedicated their cellars to holding carrots because of their ability to last for so many months without any kind of cooling. Didn't have access to refrigeration? It's time to open up that basement, buddy. One other thing that really helped carrots take center stage as one of the most commonly consumed vegetables across the United States. Canned food being introduced during this time was really a generational switch-up from the norms people were used to. Canned carrots were expensive, just a bit more, and it wasn't as convenient as growing them in your own garden, but it was still something. I mean, you could get 0-15s. If you got really lucky during the Depression, you could even put in some meat drippings. Carrots gave a lot of vitamin A too, which a lot of people thought was really necessary back then. Remember what I said about keeping yourself healthy because it avoided doctor's trips? Yeah, that. Crazy Cow cereal was another popular item by General Mills in the middle of the 1970s, and this was a breakfast cereal that came in only 2 flavors, which was a little odd for cereals at the time, and they were chocolate and strawberry. What made this really special was that it was milk that had been turned into a flavored milkshake, and that meant that it was interactive. You know what they say, the best way to make food for kids is to make sure it's something they can mess around with too. Parents caught on to that early, and they would often pack some Crazy Cow cereal as a side for their children. It had a short run because it would get discontinued sometime into the 80s, but a lot of the early short-term success it had because of kids that loved the cereal made it a novelty item that still got remembered even after it bowed out and went out of the rat race. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. Favorite from this list, mashed potato patties. They were a genius way to use up leftover potatoes while creating a tasty treat. Potatoes going to waste during the Great Depression? Now that's just vile. It was like the 8 deadly sins. If you had leftover mashed potatoes, you'd mix them with a little flour, maybe an egg if you had one, and season them up with salt and pepper. Form them into patties, fry them up in a pan until they are crispy, and suddenly those leftovers were a star of the meal. Their crispy outside and soft inside made them everyone's favorite, even though they were made from the simplest ingredients. You could eat them on their own if you had some gravy or maybe even some vegetables. Now that's a whole meal if you ask me. Mashed potato patties were a hit because they were so easy to make and could feed the whole family with minimal effort. Who doesn't like fried potatoes? I know a person that doesn't. My mother. Nothing fried will ever step foot in her kitchen. So there weren't any potato patties for us. Actually, that's not true. They were just oven-baked. I guess they weren't so bad. I am just bitter that they weren't fired. Fried potato patties were crunchy, satisfying, and a great way to give new life to everyone's favorite pantry staple, potatoes. Beaten potato hash was yet another comfort food that was really popular during this entire fiasco. So, beets were something that people grew in their backyard victory gardens, and potatoes, well, you're already pretty well acquainted with their status during all of this. I just realized, despite going on and on about victory gardens, I haven't explained what they are yet. Basically, people began to make use of any soil, fertile ground, or just any spot they had in their backyards that could grow something. This was how people traded with each other and how they lived because it was food you were growing, so it was free, it was healthy, and you got access to a wide variety of crops. The downside was the waiting game, and it was a pretty lengthy one when it came to beets. They were cheap enough to get at local markets, though, so people always had that as a secondary option too. Potatoes, on the other hand, were something people exclusively grew because it was extremely hard to find them in stores. People just emptied those shelves way too fast. You'd mix some bacon fat in, around 2 tablespoons, and then just an onion and salt and pepper. A skillet would work, and then you'd have yourself a warm plate of hash. Donka toaster snacks were kind of a runner-up to Pop-Tarts, but they were still really popular in the 1970s. They just didn't have the same star factor appeal that Pop-Tarts did. But hey, that's no reason to be ashamed. Second place in a competitive market like America is still a pretty good brag. Though they could have done more to separate themselves and have their own identity, which kids love. No, really, why do you think Hot Wheels did so well? Think they were the first company to notice that young boys love toy sports cars that go zoom really fast? They just set themselves apart like that. These ones were seen as a discount version of Pop-Tarts because they were also a toaster pastry and came in flavors with fruit or sweet fillings, and sometimes they had frosted tops. That's basically Pop-Tart's entire flow, but I digress. Sometimes a similar product isn't the best way to go. It's not really the worst either. Pepsi and Coke are both bar for bar almost the same, but you still get people fawning over both. Kids definitely had the same reaction to these toaster snacks too, especially because they held together really well, and the individual packaging meant that they were wonderful as far as packing them into lunchboxes went. A really ideal, no fuss and no mess dessert, unless you had Pop-Tarts, of course. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. Homemade vegetable pancakes were a Depression-era favorite for stretching limited ingredients. The beauty of pancakes in general is that you could throw in anything you had lying around, from vegetables and fruits to nuts and chocolate. But for veggie pancakes, people usually turned to carrots, potatoes, onion, and zucchinis. They were a great way to get something warm and filling on the table without needing a lot of ingredients. They were easy to make, cheap, and full of flavor thanks to the caramelized veggies. They could be served for breakfast, lunch, or dinner since they were so versatile. Plus, they were a sneaky way to get kids to eat their vegetables. Anything in pancake form will be eaten in a matter of seconds. These homemade vegetable pancakes were a resourceful way to show just how creative people could get in hard times. And on the upside, they were fun to make and even more fun to eat. Let's take a moment and admire the moms of the last century. They were creative, never failing in trying to make their kids healthy and happy. Always on the go, always trying to make the best possible meals for entire families. These homemade vegetable pancakes are the perfect example of that. I mean, just thinking about putting veggies in pancakes makes me want to barf. But hey, when all you had in your pantry were veggies, you had to make some use of them. Cornmeal mush with gravy was one of the best things families living in the Great Plains could hope for. The gravy wasn't just something they threw in for the sake of it, to fill themselves up. It actually added a lot and made the cornmeal significantly better. It really brought out the flavor that was already there, and getting your money's worth was never really an issue with this dish. Cornmeal was something that was so regional that a lot of families just ended up growing up on it exclusively. It was pretty hard to get an affordable meal for yourself back then, but things like this made it just a bit easier to manage. You could even buy cornmeal from your local stores for barely a few cents a pound, so that made it even easier for people living in urban areas and hubs to get it. One of the best advantages of cornmeal was that you didn't have to have an oven or a stove to make something of it. You could just as easily do it over an open fire too. This mush, for example, was something most people made without any kind of kitchen appliances. Concentrate cereal was an interesting lunch cereal that parents would sneak into their children's lunchbox, and surprisingly, children fell in love with this cereal. Kellogg's Concentrate cereal launched way back in 1959, and although it was a little different from the colorful, sugary cereals kids loved, it was actually a hit. This cereal was all about packing in the nutrition, which made it a unique choice for health-conscious families. Imagine small, crisp flakes in a tiny box that were practically bursting with protein, vitamins, and minerals, designed to give families a diet insurance of nutrients. You could add it to almost anything, from soups and casseroles to waffles and salads, which made it a perfect companion for mothers who were wondering what lunch should be packed in the morning. People loved the taste and the idea that it was filling, yet low-calorie at 106 per ounce. Kellogg's discontinued the cereal by 1981, but concentrate remains one of those cereals that fans remember fondly as an interesting and very customizable quick lunch. For many, it was more than just cereal. It is a forgotten lunch partner that must be brought back by Kellogg's. We're going to take a bit of a deep dive into a cuisine that we haven't really explored before. I'm talking about caponata, which is a very traditional Sicilian dish that goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's supposed to be a sailor's dish. Can you believe that? It got that reputation attached to it because the birthplace of caponata was Sicily. There's no specific restaurant or name that's credited with making it, but if you ever went there, you'd know just how much the people appreciate this. The first time this became popular in America was when Mediterranean cuisine and Italian immigrants were mixing together and creating all sorts of new dishes, as well as bringing old familiar ones from their homeland. The best part about this dish for a lot of people was that it gave a chance to a vegetable, which otherwise people just aren't too fond of. I mean, eggplants aren't really the most main course worthy idea you could think of, right? Pair that up with some tomatoes, onions, olives, and capers and cook it in vinegar, sugar, and olive oil. Make a nice little traditional agrodolce sauce, and you'll get this extremely earthy dish with a lot of complex flavors going for it. Onion and potato frittata was an everyday favorite because they turned simple ingredients into a meal that felt special. Potatoes were cheap and filling, and onions added the extra flavor. The beauty of frittata was in its simplicity. You'd slice up some potatoes and onions, fry them until golden, and then pour beaten eggs over the top. Cook it until the eggs are set, and just like that, you had a hearty, savory dish that worked for any meal. It was one of those dishes that could stretch to feed a crowd. Plus, if you had a little cheese lying around, you were going to become a favorite lunch host. It was an easy way to make a meal feel complete without having to use any expensive ingredients. This frittata was super versatile as well. You could throw in whatever veggies or leftovers you had on hand. Whether eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, onion and potato frittata was a reliable go-to that made the most out of limited supplies and left you feeling full and satisfied. It proved that a little creativity could vastly change the food game in the house. So, making a lot of use out of the stuff you could grow easily was just the way people were living. You already know how convenient of a setup people had with cabbage, so the next stop was incorporating some awesome cabbage-based dishes into the weekly diet plan. Cabbage rolls stuffed with leftover rice were one of the best things to make because you could kill 3 birds with 1 stone. You were eating, for 1, and for 2, it was really healthy. Third of all, you would get to use any leftover rice and make sure absolutely nothing went to waste from your pantry. Sounds like someone being neurotic? Well, when the difference between being hungry is whether or not you manage a sack of rice properly, I think it's fairly justified. Now, I gotta say, people really weren't that open to cabbage yet. I mean, as a standalone item. They were used to having it as an embellishment in most dishes, but they didn't have anything that was cabbage-centric. The 1930s wasn't just a decade of struggle and resilience, it was also a decade of broadening horizons. People were acquiring tastes they never had thought they would ever enjoy. Today you take some Lunchables and call it a day. Pepperoni, cheese, a makeshift dough that'll probably anger several Italians. Yeah, that's a modern-day lunchbox. But back then, Danish rings were actually popular in some areas of America as a snack. They would hold way easier than Danish go-rounds, and the crunchiness of the ring itself made for the perfect snack. When you're having lunch, you don't really need a full-blown meal like you'd get at home, but you kind of want something that'll just put some pep back in your step. It would be pretty odd for some kid today to pull up with Danish rings to school, but I guess that just goes to show how times change, don't they? Personally, I think it's a little too old-fashioned for me. Danish rings might be alright as snacks, but taking it as a lunchbox every day might be a bit overboard. I'd definitely switch it up with some other items on the list to keep things fresh. They couldn't catch on as a mainstream snack though, because even if they held better than go-rounds, they would still tend to get squished or messy. Plus, it wasn't until the late 80s that parents went all in on convenience food and snacks for lunchboxes instead of homemade items. We have chicken and collard greens pilau, which is just the perfect dish to have if you're aching for something that involves a lot of rice in it. The steamed and boiled chicken mixed with the pilau as a base for the dish gives it an aroma that's pretty much unbeatable. Back in the middle of the 20th century, if you really wanted to experiment with some foreign cooking and tastes, then you would go into African American communities and try out the best of their soul food. You'd have to look around a little for the really nice restaurants, especially if you were in places like the southern parts of America, but nonetheless, people found a way. Pilau itself is also a dish that's extremely common in the subcontinent for many reasons. People use basmati rice for this, which is a little different from the rice you guys might be used to, but if you give it a shot, you might find that it has a more full flavor all around. Also, don't even get me started on how good this is for you. If you're a gym bro looking for a great way to add some tasty protein and carbs to your diet, then chicken and collard greens with some pilau is a pretty flawless place to start. Vegetable stir-fry with rice. It was a favorite back in the day for its low price and because it was a great way to use up any leftovers. The concept was simple. Grab a few vegetables, carrots, cabbage, onions, or whatever you had, chop them up and toss them in a hot pan with some oil. Stir-fry until everything was crispy and cooked through and serve it over rice for a filling meal. Rice was the perfect base for any meal because it was inexpensive and went a long way. The vegetables added color, texture, and nutritional value, making it seem like it was a specialty of some sort, without too much cost or effort. If you were lucky enough to have some soy sauce or spices, you could add even more flavor, but even with just salt and pepper, this stir-fry got the job done. It was also one of those dishes that felt a little fancy because it came together so fast and tasted great, even when the pantry was looking sparse. Egg drop soup with bread crusts was a way for people to get rid of things that were unnecessary and about to spoil. See, if you didn't want to eat what was there, what you really didn't want to do was let it go to waste. Eggs, especially, were hard enough to come by as it was. That's why rural areas typically enjoyed more eggs than others, because in urban hubs, they would just vanish as soon as they stocked the shelves and fridges with them. Rural areas with farming traditions still had chickens they could use for eggs, though, so there was always that. The base of the soup was a simple broth that used bones, vegetable leftovers, and water with basic seasonings. The bread crusts were to ensure that people used up every last bit of their bread, because if it meant you could save the good stuff for later, that was a decision you really wanted to make. String cheese was an honest-to-God lunchbox classic that did everything right. Okay, so you had these cheese sticks that you could peel and package individually, and then they were mild-flavored and really fun to play with. Like I just said, the best way to capture a customer base with young folk is to make sure the food is something they can mess around with and have fun eating, not just open and consume. Though, if you really want to make a name for yourself in the cutthroat world of lunchbox adequate snacks, where even the slightest change in mood and tastes can mean your hard-earned product ends up going out the window, you need to consider the tastes of parents, too. See, it's not just about what makes a good lunchbox meal for kids, but also what makes a good meal for their parents. Is it easy to prepare? Is it too much of a fuss? Is the packaging easy to open? Does it have basic snack appeal that caters to a lot of basic things kids look for in food? All valid questions that string cheese answered by simply being an incredibly amazing snack and meal. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South in African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. so maybe it does work? Simple egg drop soup was a staple because it took next to nothing to make, but still felt like a real meal. What you needed was some broth, homemade or from whatever scraps you could find, and a few eggs. You'd bring a broth to a simmer, whisk the eggs in a bowl, and slowly and carefully drizzle them in a hot liquid while stirring. The eggs would instantly cook, turning into soft, silky ribbons that made the soup what it is to this day. If you've got leftover veggies, be prepared to make this soup, and if you've got meat, even better. You've just made yourself a delicacy. Egg drop soup was a meal that stretched what little you had left while still managing to be comforting and filling. Even if you were running low on ingredients, egg drop soup made you feel like you were eating something homemade and special, instead of scraps you could barely gather. It could warm you up, fill you up, and the best thing of all, it took you, maybe and only maybe, about 5 minutes to make. Casseroles were definitely out of the question for most people. Yet a substitute that could fit into the picture was vegetable and noodle casseroles. Noodles were easy to make from scratch, and most people would even buy them in bulk because they hadn't suffered the worst of price hikes. That was reserved for things like good and common cuts of meat, which is part of why you'd never see your average, everyday casseroles on the table anymore. The best part of this dish was in two strengths that made it pretty much ideal for the Dust Bowl, though. Vegetable casseroles could be made with just about anything that people were growing in their victory gardens. Onions, olives, lettuces, and cabbages. If it's green and comes from the ground, you can put it in this casserole. Next, noodles were a filling thing to put in there too, because it kept your appetite down. Fiber, you know? Same reason gym bros are always telling you to eat oatmeal in the morning, it's like nature's Ozempic. The second strength this dish had was that it was really something you could make in bulk. I mean, once people got to making this, they could make it for more than just their family. Do you know how big of a deal that is? To actually have more than you need in a time like the 1930s? People saw the advantages to dishes like these and started making them for the entire community, often sharing ingredients and vegetables. It was actually pretty wholesome, if only it weren't in one of the worst times of the 20th century. Pop Rocks actually hit the shelves somewhere around the mid of the 1970s, and these were just a super hit from the get-go. They were these small pieces of carbonated candy, and they made a very fizzy popping sensation when kids ate them, and that made them a novelty. It is said that when a kid would discover a Pop Rock, they would experience the same euphoria of a promotion at work. These were also really popular among the playground, as kids would always be enjoying Pop Rocks while playing around with their friends in the sand. It's the little things like that which really add to the whole aspect of making it aimed for kids, you know? They enrich those little daily experiences that make up everything a child needs to have. Plus, despite these being candy, they didn't really even need any kind of refrigeration. They just needed to be packed properly, and kids could even show them off because at first they were a little pricey and rare, so it was like being the cool kid when you decided to bring them to school. In the history of Brooklyn, you'll find something that was really popular, which was ham cheese balls. These were the perfect bite-sized appetizer to gorge yourself on while you waited for the main meal. A lot of grandmas would have handwritten notes tacked onto family cookbooks about how to make the perfect ham ball, what the ratio of meat was, how much cheese you needed to put in, how much you needed to roll them and shape them before they were perfect. It was one of those snacks that just did well everywhere. In Iowa, too, it was one of the most easily available snacks you could find anywhere in the state. All in all, it's one of the best things to ever come out of the Midwest. And no Christmas is honestly complete until you down a platter of ham cheese balls and make the tray look spotless. Have you ever grown up around these? Do you still remember the taste? It's not something you would find so often nowadays, but the days when it was really everywhere were some good ones. Oh, the techniques that people picked up with dumplings helped them out in other areas too. Namely, making homemade bread. You'd pair that up with lard spread and onion slices, and you'd pretty much be eating as good as someone could be during the bowl and the Depression. What a time, though, at least in retrospect. You have one of the worst economic crashes in documented history paired with Mother Nature having an equally historical fit. It's really no wonder that circumstances like that awoke the baker and home chef in a lot of people, probably just out of practicality. Anyway, Back to homemade bread. So for this, all you'd need is flour. Most people were using all-purpose flour since it was cheaper to work with. Water, yeast, and salt were the rest of the gang. If you couldn't get your hands on some yeast, sourdough starter would work well too. Honestly, one of the hardest things to get was just the sugar needed for the brain, since granulated sugar was getting pretty hard to come by. Next, the lard spread. So during this time, people really started adopting the mentality of not wasting anything, not even a single part of the animal. That definitely meant all the lard too, which people would hold on to exactly for days like this. On its own, it doesn't exactly inspire an appetite though, but with some onion slices, you've had worse. So far, we got some killer products from the likes of General Mills, and you'd be sorely wrong if you missed other Titanic names like Nabisco, which came up with their own bite-sized snacks which did massive numbers. They were known as Toastettes, and they were like these Pop-Tart toaster pastries that were a pretty famous competitor for Kellogg's own food lines aimed at children. These Toastettes would usually have berry-based fillings, which also made them more popular whenever one of those like strawberries or blueberries were in season. They also had apple cinnamon, and the Toasty itself was like a sandwich with these fillings with optional frosting if you wanted to go for it. You know how McDonald's intends you to eat its fries and its sundae separately? Well, Toastettes are supposed to be toasted right as you get them, but a lot of kids enjoyed skipping that part and just treating it like a dessert. Plus, the fact that they would remain cold in metal containers meant that they had a pretty long and refreshing shelf life, and that made them ideal for hotter states like Arizona and California. Toastettes were also packaged in a way that made them super easy to grab on the go. Kids could stuff them in their lunchboxes, backpacks, or even their pockets, making them the ultimate in portable snacks. And since they were more filling than regular cookies or crackers, they felt like a mini meal rather than just a sugary treat. Some parents even felt they were healthier than other options, with their fruit-based fillings and pastry shell, which made them seem a bit closer to real food. The stage for this dish goes all the way to Cleveland, Ohio, in 1970. The part of Ohio I'm specifically talking about is South Euclid, and the company I want to tell you about is Amster Pizza Bagel, Inc. They first submitted the idea for pizza bagels to the Copyright Office in 1970, which was the first official birth of the dish. However, the idea was pretty much cooking up a long while before it got the fine print out of the way. You can credit Anthony DeMauro for that, since the actual first time he made one was in 1957. 13 years of messing around with and perfecting the recipe led to a show stealer of a product for Amster Pizza Bagel Inc., which a lot of other fast food chains found hard to compete with. They even had a catchy mid-90s slogan, which you'll probably remember if you were a millennial from those times. Pizza in the morning, pizza in the evening, pizza at supper time, with an earworm of a jingle to go along with it. Baked potato bar was the Great Depression gem that turned a humble spud into a customizable feast. As we've learned so far, potatoes were one of the cheapest groceries back in the day, so they were widely available. This made them the perfect base for a meal. You'd bake a bunch of potatoes until they were soft and fluffy, then set up a bar of sorts with whatever toppings you could scrape together. Butter, leftover veggies, a sprinkle of cheese, or even some canned beans all work to turn that plain potato into something exciting. This do-it-yourself approach lets everyone in the family get creative with their toppings, making mealtime fun even with limited options. The best part is that potatoes play as a blank canvas in this recipe. You could add whatever you thought fit the best. So even if you ate them every day, you wouldn't get tired of them and they'd still be interesting. A baked potato bar was the ultimate budget-friendly meal that let you feel like you were in control of the lunch. Well, as much as you could be during the Great Depression. That helped a lot throughout arguably all of the Dust Bowl was the simple luxury known as cornbread. Cornbread was made entirely out of cornmeal, and that was one of the things that was still abundant throughout America. Here, you can run out of walkers in busy hospitals, but never corn. Funny how that one works, right? Anyway, the Dust Bowl was something that almost entirely hit rural areas throughout the Great Plains. You had places like Kansas, Kentucky, Colorado, Orlando, Texas, and so many more areas hit badly by the horrible circumstances that led to the bowl. How was your average schmuck supposed to stay happy and keep his family fed? Well, cornbread and beans were the peasant folks' answer to nature throwing a temper tantrum. Now, it was obvious that the only way they were going to be helped was if they did it themselves, so lots of people began trying to cultivate crops of corn. Beans, particularly pinto and navy beans, were still relatively affordable, even in the face of the Depression. Seriously, I can't talk about how horrible that entire decade was for America. It was like a series of unfortunate events, each even worse for the economy than the last. People held on to things like cornbread and beans like they were pearls. Marathon Bar was introduced by Mars in 1973, and it was a chocolate caramel bar that had one thing going for it. Boy, when I tell you this thing was long, I need you to imagine over 8 entire inches. For a caramel bar! Now, I love my sugar rushes just as much as the next person does, but at some point you gotta draw the line, right? Though, personally, I love them a little too much and would like an extra large version. Anyway, back to the children that enjoyed these. So this bar had a lot more supporting its wow factor, but the length was definitely the biggest attraction. The chewy and gooey texture of the bar meant that it was amazing for kids, who were already big fans of chocolate bars like that anyway. They were a great lunchbox item, and were often a popular pick for school parties too, and they made the best of both worlds by including chocolate and caramel. They became an incredible choice for children in the 1970s, and they held up really well in lunchboxes. Plus, the packaging was really recognizable to children. To only find a Coco Vin Blanc in French restaurants that really knew what they were doing. Top-of-the-line premium joints, the kind you'd maybe have to save up for. The black variation itself is a slow-cooked chicken stew, and this one is made with white wine instead of red wine. Some people that were familiar with the ins and outs of French cooking and had a good grasp of it would actually even make it at home. And I'm talking about before the slow cooker became everyone's best friend. They would really do the hours-long prep work just to get a taste of this, and it was worth it too. However, when the slow cooker did eventually come in, they let go of the ceramic pots, the cast iron Dutch ovens, and the hours spent waiting for it to simmer and absorb the flavors. This meant that you no longer had to go out just to a restaurant for a coq au vin blanc. You could just as easily prepare one overnight at home without even paying much attention to it. The braising process was easily imitated by any standard cooker. Naturally, that kind of accessibility means a huge rise in fans, and this dish had no shortage of them even outside of French-American households that focused a lot on eating traditional, rather than keeping up with the times and going for canned, processed food. Before, cabbage was one of those winter dishes that just added something comforting to the table. So, we mustn't forget cabbage rolls. Cabbage leaves acted as a wrapper for a mixture of rice and onions, and sometimes ground meat, though during the Depression, the filling was often just rice and whatever vegetables were available. Once rolled up, the cabbage bundles were simmered in a basic tomato sauce, which made them tender and flavorful. They were a great way to stretch a small amount of food to feed a family. The cabbage was cheap and plentiful, and the rice was filling, so even if you didn't have much to put inside, the meal still felt hearty. The tomato sauce added a bit of extra flavor so the dish didn't feel dry. This dish is still widely popular in the East, only it's called something a bit different: sarma. Sarma is a traditional dish in some Eastern countries like Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and others. And it's definitely not considered cheap there. It is a true delicacy of those parts, and people proudly make it for big and important holidays. It is interesting how some dishes can be considered both a delicacy and a budget-friendly alternative in hard times. People foraged for a lot of other things too, not just dandelions. One of them was a dish known as vegetable and rice-stuffed mushrooms. It was a wonderful showcase of the adaptability the American people were displaying throughout this decade too. Culturally, it was one of the first ways that people started to incorporate wild mushrooms into their diets. Before this, the American nation wasn't too familiar with using wild mushrooms. This was one of the first ways that people were introduced to them, and stuffing rice with it was pretty much the perfect way to introduce them to people too. It was a switch up from what people were relatively used to eating during the Depression too. since that was really just paltry vegetables that they grew here and there or canned food. Stuffed rice with mushrooms was still something that people could eat happily, though, and things that were full of flavor and actual taste. It was really heartwarming. The kind of thing that got you out of bed and took off the edge after a very long, struggle-filled day. Throwing it way back now, General Mills Shark Bites were perhaps the most loved fruit snacks that made every lunchbox taste better. The aquatic, fruity little gummies are a distant memory for many of us now, but back then, the sharks made everyone's day as the perfect dessert to their lunch. I particularly find the rise to fame of Shark Bites quite interesting. You see, in 1975, the famous film Jaws released, and kids all across America were taken by a storm. The success of the film caused children to fall in love with sharks, and Shark Bites seemed to be the perfect snack parents could give their children to keep them happy. It was a pretty big flex in school if you had a pack of Shark Bites on you, maybe even made you famous across school. Jaws wasn't the only element that attracted kids. General Mills came out with a challenge for students. Each pack of Shark Bites would have different shaped sharks that were blue, but some rare packs would have a great white gummy shark. You would have to fish through packets of Shark Bites to find this rare gummy, adding to the excitement of the students. Do you understand why Shark Bites were so popular now? If General Mills brings back these snacks, I'd be the first in line to buy them. Bourbon and chicken wings go together like birds in the sky, or like strawberry jam and bread. They've been one of the most definable aspects of American cooking and eating ever since they were first made in New Orleans, Louisiana, which got popular for its bourbon chicken. It used to be a subset of Cajun-themed cooking, but slowly, over time, its roots got diluted, and it became more of a nationwide thing that everyone got into. One of the most popular types of bourbon whiskey was cherry bourbon, and one of the best ideas people ever had was mixing that with chicken wings to get a cherry bourbon edition of the best side dish ever known to man. The taste is impeccable. The bourbon enhances every single thing about the chicken wings, while adding a new flavor from the cherry aspect. It kind of gives it this sweet aftertaste that's not really overbearing. You know, some of the best additions and flavors to a tried and tested classic are ones that don't overstay their welcome. They don't overwhelm what you already love about the dish, they just take it a step further with the addition of something new. That's why this dish got so popular at cookouts and pot roasts and was a given if your family was having a pizza night. African American families in particular would love a big combo of chicken wings doused in cherry bourbon, because no party really felt complete without them. You might think I'm over-exaggerating because what can whiskey really do? Well, once you bake these wings to crispy perfection and then add them in a cherry bourbon BBQ sauce, you'll know just how good they are for yourself. Give it a try because it's probably the easiest recipe on this list so far. Sweet potato bisque was a Depression-era dish that made something rich, special, and comforting out of the simplest ingredients. Sweet potatoes were cheap, filling, and packed with nutrients, making them a staple. To make this bisque, you'd boil the sweet potatoes, mash them up, and blend them with water or milk to create a smooth, creamy soup. Add a bit of salt, pepper, and maybe a sprinkle of cinnamon, and you had yourself a bowl of warmth and comfort. What made sweet potato bisque so great was how satisfying it was for so little cost. The natural sweetness of the potatoes gave it a rich flavor without the need for expensive ingredients, and its creamy texture made it feel indulgent. Whether eaten on its own or with a slice of bread, this bisque was the perfect way to fill up during tough times. It was a simple, hearty dish that provided warmth, nutrition, and comfort. It is popular to this day and considered somewhat of a luxury. It is widely used in high-end restaurants, whether it is served as a side dish or as a full-course meal. And by that I mean, it is served on those big plates with just a sprinkle of food in the middle, which costs more than my shoes. But never mind that, it was and is, to this day, a fall staple. Cabbage and noodle casserole was again a really typical dinner. It's a bit different from the vegetable and noodle casserole we went over because this one exclusively only deals with cabbages. One thing that made this dish really popular was the emphasis on community that people were placing. People with extended families had those relatives traveling all over the state and the country to come live with their in-laws or their sons and daughters. It only made sense to stick together and to take care of yours during all of this. Of course, that also did mean there were a lot more mouths to feed than before. Families solved these issues by relying on big batches of things like cabbage and noodle casserole. You would cook the noodles in a really large pot, and then you would prepare the cabbage. The way you do this is by dicing the cabbage into small bits and using leftover bacon and other meats as fillers. Keep layering that up until you have something resembling a casserole, and you're pretty much good to go. Plus, lots of neighborhoods would work together on dishes like this, and it would just help overall since everyone had their resources pooled together. For once, people didn't have shortages when things worked like that. The best for last, in the early 1900s, the Jackson Cracker Company of Jackson, Michigan, developed a small, round cracker called the Jackson. The company was bought by Nabisco in 1919. Nabisco introduced the Ritz Bits cracker in 1934. Little did they know that these salty, cheesy crackers would go on to become a household lunch item that every child would urge their parents to buy. Even if you think about Ritz Bits right now, you may be getting hungry just thinking about the bite-sized, disc-shaped and lightly salted crackers. I don't know about you, but I am getting hungry just thinking about them. It is no wonder why these crackers got so famous. Round, biscuit-shaped, salty crackers make for the perfect munchie that children can eat after a long day of school and studies. It also helped that the packets were so small that they could fit right in your lunchbox without causing any trouble. Ritz Bits were truly an iconic snack. So today we had shrimp and sushi, and before that we had prawn, and even before that we had catfish and cod. So what came even before that? You'd be surprised, but in the 17th and 18th centuries in America, eels were really common. Early Americans absolutely loved one rendition of eel, which was Old LP, and the fishermen used to keep a sharp and keen eye out for any eel available in lakes. Whether it was local streams or popular fishing spots like Cape Cod, everyone would always gather around a fish market whenever fresh eel was in stock, because everyone wanted to make a fresh batch of eel pies for the family. Despite how tastes change severely throughout the centuries, one thing stays the same. A grandmother always loves creating new food for her children and grandchildren, and a lot of home cooks worked hard to perfect the ultimate old eel recipe that they ended up passing down throughout their families. The taste of old eel pie itself is something that's really hard to describe. It has a texture that's almost similar to apple pie, but it has a really sweet and savory taste working together at the same time. It feels like these flavors are going in opposite directions when you think about them, but in that single pie, all of them manage to sync and create something really unique. Would you ever recreate this dish in your own home, or is it too old-fashioned of a protein for you? Chickpea salad was the Depression-era version of a light, protein-packed lunch that didn't break the bank. Chickpeas were cheap and easy to store, and when mixed with a few pantry staples, they became the star of a surprisingly tasty salad. All you needed were some canned or cooked chickpeas, a bit of oil, vinegar, and whatever veggies or herbs you had on hand. If you had onions, celery, or even a tomato, chop them up and toss them in. This meal felt refreshing, yet filling. The chickpeas provided protein and fiber, while the vinegar and oil dressing brought everything together with a bit of zest. Chickpea salad could be served as a side dish, or just slap it between some bread and call it a sandwich. It was perfect for when you needed a quick, no-cooking meal. It was budget-friendly and packed with nutrients. It's no surprise that people still enjoy chickpeas to this day and make an effort to incorporate them to their daily nutrition. It was and still is one of those dishes that made you feel like you were eating healthy, even though your pantry was running low on options. So next we have stewed tomatoes and day-old bread. Now, it was really common to still use bread that had been sitting around for a long while. You could even say it had gone stale. That was still bread, and usually it was a loaf you spent a decent amount of flour, yeast, and water on. Now, the tomatoes were an entirely other story. You would either grow these in your backyard, or you would get the canned stuff. Canned tomatoes are pretty much how we as a nation survived these crisis-filled times. It was food that you could get that was ready-made and didn't have to be refrigerated. It was built to last, and that's exactly the kind of thing people needed back then. This was really just the kind of thing that would humble you, though. It was one of those things that when people would eat, they'd realize the gravity of their situation. It also helped people find their resolve on tough days, as hard as it was to stomach day-old bread. Still, you have to hand it to the people. They really tried their best with what they had. It lasted well enough anyway. Iced honey buns were these individually wrapped pastries that had a pretty sweet and soft bun-like texture and the most visually appealing and delicious frosting. They were actually a little more popular with girls than they were with boys, but don't let that fool you into thinking it was a completely one-sided domination. Boys were known to get pretty busy with these iced honey buns because, hey, good food is good food. The glaze, the fluffiness of the bun, the first bite that felt like heaven, and only made recess that much better. These were all common experiences of kids that grew up with these honey buns in their lunchboxes, and since they were just so easy to fit in one, it meant less work for the parents too. The filling really kept these going, and they were perfect for children in private schools who often had parents going to work early and not being able to cater to a high-effort breakfast for their children, which I think is another separate conversation we really need to have. Fisherman's stew was something that got popular because of necessity. Back then, fishermen used to be out at sea for so long that they'd often go days or sometimes even weeks without seeing home or their families. It was the cons of the job, you know? What were you going to do? Sit at home and hang your net, giving it all up because you haven't had enough time to unwind? One thing that hasn't changed about America ever is that the grind never really stops, so that certainly wasn't an option. What was an option was making the best use of whatever the catch of the day was. Sometimes you'd get shellfish or crawfish. Sometimes you'd get proper sea bass or red mullets and monkfish. If you kept some basic vegetables and seasoning with you, like red pepper, onions, cayenne, and salt, then you could still make a pretty serviceable stew. This is kind of why the term fisherman's stew is a bit of an umbrella phrase. Depending on where you are in the country or what kind of time period you're talking about, it can really mean 20 different things. Just mixing up the spices creates an entirely new dish, so imagine what it was like changing up the main star, the fish, almost every day. They were creating new stews on a daily basis without even knowing it. It caught on so much and became such an acquired taste for your average fisherman that they began having it at home too, and from there on, you can probably put 2 and 2 together. You have one really versatile dish that can work with like 15 kinds of fish, almost every seasoning in your cabinet, and every vegetable in your pantry. Stews themselves are really affordable and feed whole families while keeping everyone's health up, so it's no wonder that so many grandmas and grandpas used to serve this as lunch. Minestrone soup was the ultimate Depression-era kitchen sink meal. Got some leftover veggies, a can of beans, and a bit of pasta? Throw it all in a pot and call it minestrone. This soup was a go-to for families looking to stretch their ingredients as far as they could. Carrots, celery, potatoes, or whatever you had on hand, everything went into the pot with some broth or water and simmered until the flavors melded together. To this day, minestrone soup is one of my favorites, and for good reasons. It sparks up a nostalgic feeling in my bones and brings up old memories. Each fall and winter in our house, it was known that for the next few months we will be eating only cold weather food, which meant minestrone soup, cabbage, stuffed bell peppers or zucchini, pumpkin-tasting anything. You get the gist. So every year, as the leaves start changing colors, I know it's time to get the warm clothes out and prepare our bellies for 6-ish months of warm, comforting foods. It's not said in vain that it is the most beautiful time of the year. Let me get back to the soup. It was a hearty, filling soup full of nutrients, and on top of that, super adaptable. The beauty of minestrone was that no 2 batches were ever quite the same, but they were always delicious. This soup was great for feeding a large number of hungry mouths on a budget, and it only got better as it sat in the fridge. So, turnip greens and cornmeal dumplings. These are actually even more affordable than the dumplings we went over previously. Dumplings that use flour were a little more unrealistic than ones that used cornmeal, after all. Turnip greens were also really inexpensive. You could get a bundle for around 15 cents, and that was something people could spare. especially on something like turnips, which were filled with health benefits. Not only that, you could spin this dish 100 different ways, so you'd almost never get bored of what you were eating either. You'd get a list of things essential to keeping the temple that is your body in good shape. Iron, calcium, vitamin K, carbs, fat, you name it, this dish probably has it. So you had a dish that was really filling while also being economical and healthy. This was pretty much the golden trio of traits that any plate of food needed to succeed with the masses. As far as the preparation process went, that's where this dish was just a bit lacking. You had to put in a lot of work to get this into a shape that was fit for eating. Now, it wasn't really necessary to use flour, but if you were, you'd get better dumplings. Most people didn't though. They just really struggled with adding the right amount of the cornmeal mix into the turnip greens while they simmered in the broth. That little step decided what kind of flavor you'd end up with. Candy snacks were some of the best things that Kraft ever gave us. They were one of the finest cheese spreads you could ever make the decision of buying, and if this is how you were spending your money, then you were definitely doing it the right way. The most easily recognizable version had these red plastic sticks that kids would use to scoop up the cheese and put it onto crackers. By the way, is that a little weird to you? That young kids in like the 3rd or 4th grade would be having crackers for breakfast? That just really goes to show the impact of the whole World War period on America as a whole. Kids really had to become used to eating things like these for breakfast every day because other options just were not widely available or affordable at the time. Don't even get me started on the fiasco that was the stock market crash. But hard times make for frugal food, which makes for a palate that can appreciate a lot of different kinds of food and combos. That's one benefit that kids had back then that they just don't have today. To them, a lot of snacks could come in handy. And no, that pun wasn't intentional. The convenience of a handy was definitely in its pre-portioned packaging, which meant that parents didn't even have to worry about anything. They just had to pair these crackers with cheese and give them some condiments on the side, and voila, you had your child's breakfast done and dusted already, under $1 and in just half a minute. Can you really argue with the value for money there? I mean, I don't plan to be a parent soon, but I do have a cat, and prepackaged easy-to-go-for food is just a lifesaver in ways I can't describe. I wonder if it's the same for actual parents. I'm sure a lot of you do come from healthy, happy families, so let me know in the comments if this kind of food is something you'd prefer. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Now, animal crackers made a journey from the United Kingdom to the United States in the late 19th century. Categorized as both crackers and biscuits, animal crackers quickly made their place in the lunchboxes of several young students in the United States. Stauffer's Biscuit Company were the first bakers to produce animal crackers locally in America because of how popular these biscuits grew. Students fell in love with the biscuits shaped in animals like lions, tigers, bears, and elephants baked to perfection and packed in small lunchbox-sized packages. While these crackers had been available since the 1890s, 1970s onward was when they really caught wind amongst schools because of how readily available they were. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy. And it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. Macaroni and cheese loaf emerged as a popular variation in the 1970s when schools sought to diversify their menu offerings while still providing comforting and familiar foods. This dish takes the beloved elements of traditional macaroni and cheese, a mixture of cooked macaroni and creamy cheese sauce, and adds eggs and breadcrumbs to bind the ingredients into a solid loaf that can be easily sliced. The loaf is baked until the exterior is slightly crispy and golden, offering a textural contrast to the soft, cheesy interior. This format not only makes serving more efficient, but also reduces food waste, as the loaf can be cut into precise portions. Next up is the infamous garbage plate. Before you start raising eyebrows because of the name of this one, just hear me out. So this was basically a mishmash of whatever was on hand. Imagine a plate filled to the brim with macaroni salad, home fries, baked beans, and some kind of protein like sausage or ground beef. And don't forget the toppings: chili, onions, mustard, and your choice of hot sauce or ketchup. Sounds appetizing, right? The garbage plate originated in 1918, the garbage plate, and became the signature dish of Rochester. If you missed out on it, don't fret, because it's still served by numerous restaurants under names such as Rochester Plate, Trash Plate, or Simply Plate. This meal was a classic when wallets were tight back in the day and there weren't many gourmet options on hand. Plus, it had all the carbs and fats you needed to keep going through tough times, and the kids loved it. What's not to love about fries and macaroni? This dish is a classic example of don't judge a book by its cover, or in this case, by its name. Sloppy Joes have been a staple in American school cafeterias since their introduction in the mid-20th century. This dish features ground beef or pork that is sautéed with onions and garlic until browned, then simmered in a savory tomato-based sauce seasoned with Worcestershire sauce and other spices. The thick, hearty mixture is then spooned onto soft hamburger buns, creating a filling and flavorful sandwich that is both messy and delightful to eat. The preparation requires minimal kitchen equipment and ingredients that are staples in most school pantries, making it a cost-effective choice for feeding a large number of students. Moreover, the ability to prepare the meat mixture ahead of time and quickly assemble the sandwiches during busy lunch periods enhances its practicality. The familiarity of the flavors, combined with the satisfying nature of the sandwich, ensures that Sloppy Joes remain a cherished option within school meal programs. Boiled cactus pads, or as they're also called, no-pails. In the days when the pantry was bare and the garden was dust, people turned to the desert for dinner. To think that someone looked at a prickly cactus and thought, "Yep, let's eat that." Necessity is the mother of invention, and no-pails proved to be surprisingly edible and nutritious. The pads were stripped of their needles, carefully and boiled until tender, and had a tangy, almost lemony taste. They would chop them up, season them with whatever spices they had left, and serve them as a side dish. They were even thrown into stews, where their slimy texture acted as a natural thickener. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but when it came to survival, boiled cactus was a blessing in disguise. Fast forward to today, and no-pails are a delicacy in Mexican cuisine. During the Dust Bowl, they weren't about taste, they were about survival. Those desperate cooks never imagined what they saw as hardship food would one day be served in trendy restaurants. Cactus pads proved that even in hard times, resourcefulness can take ouch and turn it into yum. Tater tots were born out of innovation in 1953 by the founders of Ore-Ida, Golden, and Francis Neefy-Grigg. Utilizing leftover potato scraps from their French fry production, they created a new snack by chopping these remnants finely, mixing them with flour and seasonings, and forming them into small cylinders before deep frying them to a golden crisp. This process not only provided an efficient solution to food waste, but also produced a snack that was perfectly crispy on the outside while remaining fluffy inside. Tater tots are particularly popular as a side dish, but can also feature in recipes like casseroles, making them a versatile component of school lunches. The method of preparing tater tots involves deep frying, which, while requiring careful temperature control to achieve the perfect crunch without burning, fits well within the capabilities of large kitchen operations in schools. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Which forgotten lunch would you pack for yourself tomorrow? Drop your favorite memory in the comments below, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep bringing back the recipes that time nearly stole from our kitchens.